I'm Cliff Groh. I'm a board member of Alaska Common Ground and the former chair. I have been researching since COVID-19 hit. I've spent some of my time doing that. The effects of COVID-19, both on our state, the state of Alaska's fiscal system, and also on its economy.
So the other day on the phone, you told me that you had just finished giving 2 presentations about Alaska's economy after COVID-19. How would you describe the current state of Alaska's economy?
Well, I think there are 3 answers. There's the super bad, the bad, and a few potential bright spots.
Okay, can we get into that?
Absolutely. The super bad includes oil and tourism. Oil has just gotten hit really hard, and tourism has been hammered as well. And I can walk through some details if you'd like, Cody.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So to start out, oil is just being pummeled globally. COVID-19 has slashed demand, and thus prices to below $20 a barrel is the most recent prices I saw posted for yesterday for Alaska North Slope crude, and that's very low compared to what they have been in recent years. And some people thought sort of unimaginable or just really bad, really low. In addition to the problem that COVID-19 has created for demand, the real basic reason that way COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic, has reduced oil prices, it's reduced demand. If people are not driving much, if they don't have jobs or have reduced hours in their jobs, or are afraid to go to coffee shops, restaurants, or theaters, or are ordered not to do so by the government, they're going to drive less. So that's really reduced demand for oil. And then what's even fallen even more as a percentage is flying. There are far fewer airplanes in the air now carrying passengers. Those that do carry passengers carry pretty few. So COVID-19 has put enormous downward pressure on demand for oil, and thus the prices for oil. Additionally, another very negative factor for oil prices right now is the price war that has been simultaneously waged by Russia and Saudi Arabia, so it's simultaneous with the COVID-19. And this price war is also driving down prices of oil. So you add that up, and prices have fallen to very low levels. Then there's a final twist on the global marketplace, which we saw last month, which is a combination of a lack of or shortage of physical storage for oil and a broken futures market temporarily, at least for one day, produced negative prices. Theoretically, the price of oil was negative. You were paid to take oil away and store it. And, Cody, I haven't talked to you for a while, and I know you're an entrepreneurial, young guy. You might have, bought a few swimming pools and, made a killing. Or more seriously, you might have seen that there were some lower prices in some lower, what's called distressed assets in the market, and you thought this is time for Cody to sweep in and buy for pennies on the dollar, and that might have already occurred. Cody does get oil, man. Just a big time player. I'm just saying.
Yeah. I
know you try to hide it. Keep your light under a bushel, but that was just my sense of you as a possibility. And then, without getting too much more into your personal finances, Alaska's oil industry, turning to our own state, Alaska's oil industry is really hurting and could be hit much more. TAPS throughput, that's the volume of oil going through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, or TAPS, has been cut by at least 20% for June. It was cut first by Alaska by 50,000 barrels, and then ConocoPhillips announced it was going to cut 100,000 barrels, which would be roughly 20% from where it was at the start of 500,000 barrels a day. And so the June volume will be probably no more than 400,000 barrels a day, barring some very substantial recovery in the oil market, in the price of oil.
And how does that compare to where it usually would be?
We've been running at about 500,000 barrels a day, and we're now at 450. As of yesterday, we're at 455,000 barrels. but we're going to be at 400,000 barrels or less in June because of these cutbacks. And then there are other effects too. That reduced oil production has meant reduced jobs in Alaska. A number of layoffs have occurred in the oil patch, and there's been reduced investment as well in Alaska's North Slope, and that will reduce future production. There have been wells that have been shut down and rigs that have been laid down or idled, and a lot of wells could be shut in at an actual price of $10 a barrel if the producers expected that. And there's even a slight possibility, one of the legislators has said this, that the pipeline will be shut down in the summer. Some people said, well, he doesn't know for sure what he's talking about, or that's just a rumor. But I'll tell you, and I need to disclose something here, I know, Cody, that because, I do the podcast for free, you're thinking that, you've heard I put out a public service for free. I do everything for free. I actually did get paid once as a lawyer, and more than once, but most recently, relevantly here, I was paid as a lawyer for a law firm that worked for the city of Valdez on administrative proceedings and litigation involving the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System's property tax, or the pipeline property tax, as it was called. And I know, and by virtue of that work, that the question of the pipeline continuing to flow is both an economic question and an engineering question. And it's an economic question at some point the price of oil would get so low that as I said, some wells on our slope would be shut in, or shut down, the technical term would be shut in, and then maybe eventually the pipeline would shut down just because of low oil prices. But another factor that also might come into play at some point are some physical engineering issues. You can't run the pipeline like on, 10 barrels of oil a day. You need a certain flow through it to make it work from an engineering standpoint for the flow. And that, at some point we might get more toward that as an engineering standpoint as well. But so far, that has not happened, and it would be a really big decision by the pipeline's owners to do that because it's be hard to start it up again, but also be hard to, particularly if you shut down wells, it'd be hard to start them up again as well. But like I said, the short-run effect of the COVID-19, especially when combined with the oil price war, has been to really hurt the Alaska oil industry. But there's some medium-term and long-term risks for Alaska oil and gas as well, Cody. There's, of course, the medium-term question of just how long will the demand stay down, right? How long was the short run? Will it stretch into what some people call more the medium term? And then there's a longer-term question of, will these lockdowns that we've experienced in Alaska and we've seen around the United States and around various parts of the world, these lockdowns triggered by COVID-19 permanently increase telework, right? Like a lot of people, like you and I are talking on a Zoom call right now. Cody, we're not in the studio together. And I've been on various Zoom meetings, and I'm sure you have been. And a lot of people are doing more work more remotely and over the phone and over the internet and not in physical meetings together or, office spaces or office cubicles next to each other. And if that, maybe people get used to that. And, they say, geez, I'm tired of all this commuting. I'd like to work at home. For some people whose jobs might allow that. And that would obviously tend to reduce the long-term demand for oil. And that would have a substantial, negative effect on the Alaska oil market.
And that would be because transportation would be cut down, correct?
Yeah, both flying and both driving and flying. There's a lot of people who fly a lot for work, and to go to business meetings or to conferences or for their work, and that's been cut way down. And maybe both driving and flying are cut back by COVID-19, and people get used to that. That would have a long-term negative effect on oil prices and thus demand for Alaska oil. Those COVID-19 effects could also dovetail with concerns about climate change, which we're already working to accelerate, to cause a shift away from fossil fuels. And a shift away from fossil fuels might hurt Alaska oil particularly hard because Alaska oil tends to be more expensive. It's because, to produce anyway, because it's more remote. There's oil produced in Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas, Pennsylvania, or excuse me, it's closer to the markets, right, where it's ultimately used. But Alaska, a lot of the oil produced in Alaska, as I told a friend of mine in LA today, goes out of exhaust pipes near his house. And so that's a lot longer way to travel, and so that's one of the reasons, it's just Alaska oil is more expensive to produce. And so one way that's showing up is the recent moves that predated COVID-19, where some big banks, there's a whole giant list of them, both in Europe and in North America, including such well-known names as Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, Citi, and Goldman Sachs, have announced, hey, we banks, or this bank is among a list of banks that will no longer provide loans for investing in development, production and development of exploration for oil in the Arctic. And a lot of Alaskans, or some Alaskans, have expressed unhappiness about that. Cody, I sort of see that as a canary in the coal mine, and that's a longer-term risk for Alaska oil that's related tangentially to COVID-19, but particularly to climate change concerns that people need to think really seriously about. Climate change, and to maybe some extent COVID-19, are going to result in some oil that is currently ticketed for going out of tailpipes in LA to be instead left unburned in the ground. And Alaska oil is particularly expensive to produce in a lot of cases, and that's some of the oil that might be most in that category. I want to say one more thing about Alaska oil and gas, which is the pandemic is bad news for the development of Alaska's natural gas, which was already in a lot of problems. And I mean by that, the big deposits of natural gas that are in Alaska's North Slope, that there's been a long-held dream for, more than 40 years, since the 70s at least, since the 70s, Cody, to somehow commercialize or monetize all the natural gas on the North Slope, and to, whether it's running it through a pipeline, down somehow through, down to Tidewater in the Gulf of Alaska, or down along the Alcan Highway, or through the Mackenzie River Delta in Canada, or more recently ideas to take it off the slope, take it off in an LNG project, that would run down to the Gulf of Alaska, or through the most recent ideas you've heard about trying to take it off the slope, trying to benefit from climate change and take it directly off the slope in ships. All those projects have faced substantial difficulty now that are worse now, and it's looking even less like natural gas is going to get commercialized or monetized. And as a matter of fact, one consultant told me recently that he thought it was more likely, and I'm going to have to go slowly here because it was so surprising to me, I had a hard time believing it too. A consultant told me recently, hey Cliff, it's more likely that people in Fairbanks will get gas from Tacoma, natural gas from Tacoma, than from Alaska's North Slope. That right now the economics are looking like it might be better to somehow ship up the natural gas from Tacoma to Whittier and then get it up to Fairbanks than have the natural gas come in that long-held dream down to from the slope, the North Slope. So we'll see.
Wow, that's pretty crazy.
I was very surprised myself. I told my son when I heard that. My son, it's probably useful to point out, is 29 years old, and I said, Kevin, this is sort of like if you heard that your friend Rosie, who was a sprinter in high school, had just signed an NFL contract. Not one of your friends who played football, right? Hey, right? I was surprised I was when I heard about that possibility of gas coming south into Fairbanks, from the south into Fairbanks as opposed to the north. Because I've heard for decades about Alaska natural gas going down to Fairbanks and helping Fairbanks, and then going down to the, and then going to markets in, lower 48. And then obviously that's just not very likely right now.
And so currently, the gas that is being used in Fairbanks is from Alaska. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there's a dream that a lot of Fairbanks businesses have had for decades, that sort of large and cheaper amounts of natural gas would come from the North Slope into Fairbanks and help with higher energy prices in Fairbanks, right? And And so that was when we had pipelines, a lot of discussion of pipelines. They would often have an off-take point that would allow natural gas from the North Slope to go to Fairbanks before most of the gas, of course, went south to much bigger markets, right? But now the economics are such that it might even, that it's looking, according to this consultant who's actually paid to look into this, he told me last month, I said, hey, Cliff, it's more likely the gas will come from the south to Fairbanks. Like I said, Tacoma, Whittier, Fairbanks, as opposed to North Slope to Fairbanks. And the other way I thought about it is, not so strange as, my son's friend who's a fast, was a sprinter in high school playing in the NFL. I thought of, there's a song called The World Turned Upside Down, which is an old legend that was played by British forces when they surrendered at the end of the war, to the Americans at the end of the Revolutionary War. And that was what I just thought of, the world being turned upside down, because you have to have gas come from the south to Fairbanks, when there's been all this long-held dream for decades of having it come from the North Slope. But I'm saying that the world has been turned upside down in a number of ways, Cody, and that's the idea that a business consultant could tell me that that's a likely possibility is one of them.
How about tourism? How is that being affected?
Tourism has been hammered as well. It's just been battered. Most tourists come into Alaska on cruise ships each year, and that varies. And I think it's like 80 or 90% in Southeast Alaska, and it's well over half of all the tourists that come into the whole state come by cruise ship. And well over 2/3 of the cruise ship sailings, carrying more than over half the passengers, well over half the passengers, have been canceled. And since I first started researching this and did a presentation on Monday, the announcement was made in today's paper that 2 more cruise lines have canceled Alaska trips. So that's why I say more than 2/3 of the sailings, the trips, carrying more than half the passengers have been canceled, and that's the mean way tourists come to Alaska each year. And then when you ask about flying, like as I already said, people are afraid to fly as well. Mm-hmm. And there's just a lot fewer flights coming into Alaska, and a lot fewer passengers on them. So that's already cost a lot of jobs. It's really hard, particularly in communities that really depend on tourism a lot, like Skagway and Juneau. But it's reduces jobs in Anchorage as well, and hurts a lot of small businesses. I have heard reports that some long-established and small businesses in Alaska catered to tourists are going to declare bankruptcy, and they have some of them I've heard reports of are trying to decide whether they're going to try to go all out for some sort of federal aid, a loan, a COVID-19 loan, or some other kind of aid that might still come from Congress, or not wait for that and declare bankruptcy instead. That's certainly true for some restaurants and bars too, I think, Cody. But I think that's also true for some tourism, more directly, official tourism related to tourism businesses. And I mean Alaska-owned businesses. I don't mean the big cruise ship lines, right? Although they're in great trouble too. But I'm talking about the sort of the smaller Alaska businesses that get the tourists from the cruise ships when the cruise ship passengers arrive in Alaska.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a really tricky situation.
I agree, and it's a sad thing that a lot of Alaskans are facing some hard times. And there's another, and one of the factors I think that you have to think about, Cody, is the long-term future for tourism in Alaska. There are always going to be tourists who are going to come here, right? Mm-hmm. Remember, over half the tourists come on cruise ships, and the passengers tend to be substantially over the median age. And the age demographic that is most travels as tourists in Alaska on cruise ships are the age demographic that's most affected by COVID-19. Mm-hmm. That would be people, to put a fine point on it, who are closer in age to me, a proud 66, than you, Cody, who I believe you're somewhat south of 40. So that's an important consideration for people to think about. They're trying to decide whether to keep their tourism business going. And, obviously we're all hoping for vaccine or for really successful treatments. But right now we don't have them yet.
How about commercial fishing and state of Alaska investments? I saw that on one of your slides.
Yeah, commercial fishing is harmed as well, although apparently not as bad as oil and tourism. A veteran player, a guy who was a CEO of a fishing company, a seafood processing company for a long time before he sold out some years ago, and so has a lot of contacts in the industry. He told me that Alaska seafood prices are down as much as 30%, and that appears to be a result of some factors that include much of Alaska seafood is consumed in restaurants. As you have noticed, Cody, the restaurant business is not doing great right now.
Mm-hmm.
For weeks, people haven't been able to go into them in Anchorage and a lot of other places around the country. And I have not looked at statistics, but I'm betting that a lot of people are not buying as much in takeout as they would right through dine-in. So that's a big problem for why prices are down. The realities of fishing, commercial fishing, and seafood processing make distancing hard, and that makes supply difficult. I had one summer, I will, out myself. It was not really recently, in 1981. I did a couple of commercial fishing trips with a friend of mine that was his deckhand on a fishing boat, a small fishing boat. And then I also had worked on that same summer in a seafood processing line. That work is close work, particularly the seafood processing. A lot of the fishing, it can be too. And you have people coming in from around the country, maybe around the world, to do the work. And we've already had one case of COVID-19 caught in Cordova. And a lot of the, as you know, probably know, commercial fishing and seafood processing tends to occur in smaller remote communities in Alaska, where there are not very many medical facilities. And it's also really been difficult to fly in and out of now, particularly since Raven Air declared bankruptcy, and Alaska Airlines cut back on its flights. So it's a tricky problem, and seafood processing companies are spending a lot of money to segregate and screen their workers, and that's how this case in Cordova was caught. But it's an expensive process, and it's a problem, and because you have both demand for seafood down, and you have especially the higher end seafood that brings in more profits, and you also have a supply problem where it's hard, that COVID-19 makes it more difficult to get the work done safely.
Is it surprising to you that all it takes for complete economic turmoil is for things to be closed for a month or longer?
Our society and our economy are more fragile than we thought, Cody. That's a problem, and people need to think more clearly about that. And this is true on an individual level, where a lot of people just don't have savings.
Mm-hmm.
And I note this. I was talking to a friend of mine. That friend of mine I was talking about in LA today. His wife's assistant got laid off by the company, and she's 23 years old. And she told her, former supervisor, said, "Geez, I'm what's last hired, first fired, and I'm applying for jobs. There are like 5,000 people applying, 5,000 applicants for a job now, for the one job each job I apply for."
Mm-hmm.
And it's a grim reality and a difficult situation. Particularly for people who I would think are less skilled, have less, don't have long track records. It's hard when you're 23 to have a long track record of success in a job, various jobs, right? Just haven't had the time to build it up. And you also are, don't have usually list as many long list of skills that you've acquired over years on jobs. So it's a big problem.
So what happens to the Alaska economy if this continues and businesses remain operating at a fraction of their capacity?
It's a super big problem, and I don't know that. We're all hoping to come out on the other side. And I want to say that although Alaska's public health is not as threatened by COVID-19, I'm not going to wood when I say that. So far, we haven't had as bad an outbreak as New York or New Jersey or Michigan or Louisiana. But our economy is in some ways more vulnerable. I want to add another point that you already asked about. There's another way that COVID-19 is hurting, which is that it's cutting investment returns, not just in stocks, but in real estate. And the permanent fund is the biggest source of money for our budget. Now it comes from over half the money in the budget comes from the permanent fund earnings. and permanent earnings are going to be down, but I think over time, we may have, lower investment returns. It stands as a matter of logic, Cody, that if not people aren't working much and they're not buying much, that your general investment returns are going to be reduced.
So how are people you're presenting to reacting to all this information?
It's grim and dire, but some people think that we'll get through better. And there's also sort of a split on, sort of based on, I guess, experience in Alaska and sort of thinking clearly about sort of possible policy responses, which one traditional way to deal with this is to sort of spread money around and hope people can last longer. And the federal government's doing a lot of that. It's hard for the state to do that given that we had deficits, built-in structural deficits of about $1 billion a year each year before COVID-19 hit. Now, I expect that those deficits are going to be between $1 billion and closer to $2 billion a year for years because of the reduced, demand for oil and reduced price of oil, reduced production of oil, and there's going to be over time reduced investment earnings, and of course, less fishing and less tourism. Although the absence, because the state of Alaska doesn't have a broad-based tax, like an income tax or a statewide sales tax, the decline in the economy tends to hurt local governments right now more than it does the state. If anything, it hurts. Like, if the tourism industry loses business and loses jobs, and the commercial fishing loses business and jobs, that tends to hurt in some ways local governments even more than the state, because the state government would normally capture revenues like through a broad-based tax, like an income tax or a statewide sales tax. It doesn't have that. But a lot of local governments around Alaska, of course, do have their own local sales taxes, and that's how they finance a lot of their governments, as well as property taxes and property values. Real estate values are going to probably go down as well, Cody, because of COVID-19. Because it's going to, I think there's going to be population effects here. And particularly, the greatest population effects will be if the Alaska economy stays down, when the economy in lower 48 picks up. And then I think you'll have a substantial out-migration if that occurs. I think you're not having too many people move around the country right now, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that if Alaska's economy suffers more than those of other states because of COVID-19, I think that will produce both reduced in-migration and substantially increased out-migration.
So it's possible that one long-term repercussion of COVID-19 will be people leaving Alaska.
There could be some of that, and fewer coming, both of which, right? The way demographics in Alaska works is usually you have every year, unless you have a real famine or terrible war, you usually have more births than deaths in a place, right? Every year. That's called natural increase. So what usually affects the Alaska population, or if it's going to go down, which has gone down several years in a row before COVID-19 hit, right, the last few years. The usual way the Alaska population goes down is you have a substantial excess of out-migration over in-migration. Because you always usually have, like I said, more births than deaths. To have a net population decline, you have to have just a swamping of that by way more out-migration over in-migration. So if you have increased out-migration and decreased in-migration, then that will lead, to a lower population. And the out-migration is more obvious to see, right? Because it's easier to see the van leaving than it is to see the one that didn't come, right? You can have a picture of the one that didn't come. It's easier to photograph the one that leaves. But, both have an effect.
So we've talked a lot about doom and gloom so far. Is there anything positive you can tell me about Alaska's economy in the wake of COVID-19?
3 elements, yeah. A few bright spots, potentially. One is mining. I think that there's going to be an attempt to try to bring some mining, to do some mining of essential, so-called critical minerals, more in Alaska, of some minerals that are now mined in places like China or Africa. And I think there might be federal subsidies for that. There's a lot of minerals around the state, Cody, in deposits. It's just that often they're not economic. They're like too far from the marketplace and not worth it to develop. And maybe some federal subsidies to help bring the sort of international supply chain home. And that might be a positive economic effect for Alaska. I want to point out that in the absence of a broad-based tax, it's hard hard for the state of Alaska to make a lot of money on that because their taxes on mining are pretty low, the mining itself. And a lot of the people who might work in those mines, especially in remote areas, like 35 miles from Nome or so, will be people who live in Kansas or Florida today, or critically might even commute from Kansas or Florida, right? Like there are people who do that to work on the North Slope to develop in the oil patch. But there might be a increased additional mining projects as a result of COVID-19 in Alaska. Additionally, there might be additional military spending, sort of partly on the same logic of like, hey, we got to defend ourselves against China, or protect ourselves more, and there might be additional military spending. And then finally, there's what's going on right now, and a lot of Alaskans hope for a lot more of, which is massive civilian aid, right? More loans, more grants. And so people have to think clearly about how that's going to work. It's not clear it's going to get to everybody that might want it.
Cliff, I think that does it for my questions. As always, thank you so much for talking with me. I feel like I'm a layman when it comes to this stuff, and you always do a really good job at boiling it down. So, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Alaskans need to think really clearly about the economy going forward, but also about how we're going to pay for critical elements, public services that our state government provides. The state government, the state of Alaska, provides most of the money that it is used to pay for K-12 education in Alaska. The state of Alaska, of course, pays to maintain the road, the highways, right? And to provide a lot of other services in Alaska, including state troopers. And people need to think clearly about how we're going to pay for that, given the reduced oil production that we already saw even before COVID-19 hit, which is even lower now, and of course it's being sold at much lower prices since COVID-19 hit, and that we already had a giant fiscal deficit, a built-in structural deficit of $1 billion or more each year, and now it's going to be looks like it's going to be closer to $2 billion each year, which is a lot in a budget that's more around $5 billion a year that has been cut very substantially in the last 6 years. So Alaskans need to think very clearly about those questions. That's my advice.
For more information about how you can support local grassroots journalism, go to www.patreon.com/crude-magazine. Thank you to Trina Duber, Seward Brewing Company, The Grind Coffee Shop in Juneau, Derek Adolph, Blue and Gold Board Shop, Sharon Liska, Alaska Surf Adventure.